My name is Lena, and I used to believe love could heal anything. Now I know it can also quietly erase who you are, one beautiful moment at a time. I met Evan on a Thursday that smelled like rain and coffee. The city was gray, the sidewalks slick, and I ducked into a small cafe just to warm my hands. He walked in behind me, tall, a little messy, like he'd run through the storm without caring. When our eyes met, he smiled, not the practiced kind you give strangers, but the slow, genuine kind that disarms you before you realize it's happening. He asked if he could sit at my table because every other seat was taken. It wasn't, but I said yes anyway. He ordered black coffee, no sugar, and started talking as if we'd met before. About the weather, about the book I was reading, about how the city looked softer in the rain. His voice had warmth, and his laugh. His laugh felt like sunlight sneaking through a window you didn't know was open. That afternoon stretched into hours. By the time he left, the rain had stopped, but something else had started, something that would change the entire map of my life. He texted the next day, then the day after. Soon, I couldn't remember what mornings felt like without his messages, or how evenings sounded without his voice on the phone. We built a rhythm. Good morning texts, late night calls, shared playlists. The space between us filled with laughter and secrets and tiny promises that didn't sound like promises until later. Evan had this way of looking at me that made the world feel smaller, safer, simpler. He told me I was different, and I believed him. I'd never been anyone's different before. The first time he held my hand, it was outside that same cafe. It was cold, and his fingers were rough and warm. The moment was small, but something in me shifted, like the sound of a lock turning. That night I couldn't sleep. I replayed everything. His smile, his voice, the way his thumb had brushed across my knuckles. I told myself not to fall too fast. I told myself to be careful. But love doesn't listen to logic. It listens to rhythm and warmth and the echo of laughter you can't forget. In those early weeks, Evan became a habit I didn't want to break. We went on long walks through the park, sharing headphones and half-finished dreams. He told me he wanted to travel, to see every ocean, to never settle for ordinary. I told him I wanted peace, a little house, a garden full of sunflowers. He smiled and said, "Then I'll build that for you one day." At the time, I believed him. Because when you're in love, you believe everything sounds like forever. He met my friends and charmed them instantly. He met my mother and told her I was the kind of girl men write songs about. Even she smiled, and she doesn't warm up easily. But looking back, I realize how quickly he became everything. The spaces that used to belong to me, my time, my thoughts, my silence, slowly filled with him. I stopped painting because weekends were for Evan. I skipped dinners with friends because he didn't like crowds. I spent hours waiting for his texts, the way a flower waits for sunlight. At first, it felt like devotion. Later, I'd learn it was surrender. One night, as we watched an old movie on his couch, he leaned over and said, "Don't ever leave me, okay?" I laughed softly. Why would I? He looked serious. Because people always leave when things get hard. Promise me you won't. So I promised. It was the easiest lie I ever told. The first time he said I love you was on a rooftop, under a sky that smelled of summer rain. He whispered it like a secret, and my heart exploded in 1,000 quiet colors. I said it back without hesitation. That moment, that kiss, it felt like the universe had finally written my name beside someone else's. But what I didn't know then was that love, when it burns too bright, can leave nothing but ash. The night we made it official, he held me close and said, "You don't know how long I've waited for someone like you." His breath tickled my neck. His hands trembled slightly. I believed every word. He made me feel chosen, like out of everyone in the world, he had found me. I should have noticed how much that meant to him, being the one in control of the choosing. But when you're in love, red flags look a lot like roses. That first year was a blur of warmth and laughter. We had inside jokes that made no sense, songs that belonged only to us. I can still hear his voice singing off-key in the kitchen, still taste the burnt pancakes he insisted were perfect. I thought happiness meant never questioning anything, and maybe that's why I didn't notice when the questions started answering themselves. The beginning of the change was so quiet I almost missed it. It didn't happen all at once. It crept in softly, the way autumn sneaks into summer. Evan still kissed me good morning, still told me I was his everything. But in between the warmth, there were little pauses, sharp edges hiding in his tenderness. The first time he told me what to wear, it sounded like care. We were going to dinner, and I had put on a red dress I loved, flowy, simple, something that made me feel confident. He looked at me for a long moment and said, "You're beautiful, but maybe wear something less." Loud, I laughed, thinking he was teasing, but he wasn't. "I just don't want guys staring at you," he added, smiling, but his eyes weren't smiling, so I changed. Because that's what love does, right? It compromises. It seemed harmless then. He began to question the people around me next. He didn't like my best friend Anna, said she was a bad influence. "She doesn't really get you," he said one night. "She's jealous. She doesn't want you to be happy." At first, I argued, but he was gentle, convincing, always sounding like he just wanted to protect me. So I stopped hanging out with Anna, and when she texted me asking why, I didn't know how to explain that my happiness had started needing his approval. Then came my phone. He'd ask who I was texting, who was calling, why I took so long to reply to him. When I told him he was being paranoid, he'd sigh. "You don't understand, Lena. I've been hurt before. I just need to know you're mine." That word, mine, used to sound romantic. Now it started to sound like a lock clicking shut. He didn't like my job either. Said my boss looked at me in a weird way. When I laughed it off, he got angry. "Why is that funny to you?" he snapped. "Do you like that kind of attention?" It was the first time he raised his voice at me. He apologized an hour later, brought me flowers, said he was just tired, but the damage had already planted its seed. The next morning when I went to work, I kept my head down, and a month later, when he asked me to quit, I did. He said, "Now you'll have more time for us." He smiled when I agreed. I smiled too, but mine was trembling at the edges. My world slowly shrank until it fit inside his apartment. He was my calendar, my compass, my map. He told me what shows to watch, which friends to keep, even what food to order. And when I did exactly what he liked, he'd wrap me in his arms and whisper, "This is how love is supposed to feel, just us against the world." I thought that was romantic. Now I know that's what cages sound like when they're painted gold. One evening, we were at a small dinner with his co-workers. I made a joke, something harmless, and everyone laughed. Except Evan. On the drive home, he was silent. When I asked what was wrong, he said, "You always have to be the center of attention, don't you?" I blinked, stunned. "What are you talking about? I was just flirting," he interrupted. "With my friends. Do you think that's okay?" I froze. "Evan, I wasn't—" But he just shook his head, eyes dark. "You need to think about how you make me look." That night, I cried quietly in the bathroom, wondering how I'd gone from being his dream girl to his disappointment. The next day, he brought me coffee in bed and kissed my forehead. "Hey," he said softly, "I'm sorry about last night. I just love you too much. That's all." Love. That word was his weapon and his excuse. He'd hurt me, then heal me. Tear me down, then lift me up, until I couldn't tell the difference between comfort and control. My mother noticed it first. When she visited, she said, "You seem quieter, baby. Are you happy?" I smiled and said, "Of course." Because how could I explain that I didn't know what happiness meant anymore? When Evan came home that night, he asked, "What did your mom say?" I told him. He frowned. "She never liked me." "You know that, right?" I wanted to defend her, but the look in his eyes told me not to. So I nodded. That was the first lie I told for him. And it wouldn't be the last. Sometimes, when he wasn't around, I'd look in the mirror and not recognize myself. My clothes, my smile, even my voice felt foreign, like someone else was living my life. He'd call me his everything, and I'd believe it. But deep inside, a small voice whispered, "You used to be your own." That voice got quieter every day. The breaking point didn't come with shouting or drama. It came one ordinary afternoon when he handed me my phone and said, "Why don't you just delete your social media? You don't need all that noise." I hesitated. He smiled. "It's just distractions. You have me now." And just like that, I erased myself, piece by piece, from the world. I thought it was love. It was isolation. By the end of that year, I had no job, no friends, no hobbies, no dreams, just Evan. And every time I looked at him, I couldn't tell if I was looking at my savior or my captor. But I stayed. Because love, I told myself, is about sacrifice. I didn't realize I was the one being sacrificed. There's a kind of silence that isn't peaceful. It's the kind that buzzes under your skin, heavy, watchful, waiting for something to go wrong. That's what our apartment had turned into. Evan and I barely laughed anymore. He'd stopped calling me baby. He'd stopped saying "I love you," unless it was followed by a sigh or an argument. But I kept pretending. I smiled when he looked, cooked his favorite meals, folded his shirts just the way he liked. I told myself that if I tried hard enough, the man I fell in love with would come back. He didn't. He was there. In body, in voice, in smell. But the warmth was gone. I could feel it every time he looked through me instead of at me. The first time he scared me, it wasn't even about me. He came home one evening furious. He'd had a fight with his boss. He threw his keys on the counter so hard they cracked the tile. "Can you believe that idiot?" he shouted. I said nothing. I just stood there, frozen, while he paced back and forth, running his hands through his hair. Then he slammed his fist on the table. The sound was sharp, like a gunshot. I flinched. He looked at me and suddenly went still. His voice softened, almost broken. "God, Lena, I didn't mean to scare you. I'd never hurt you." I nodded, even though I wasn't sure. He kissed my forehead and whispered, "You know I'd never do that, right?" And I believed him, because I wanted to. But fear is a slow poison. It builds quietly, drop by drop, until it lives inside your heartbeat. Soon, it wasn't just his anger. It was his moods, his silences, his unpredictable kindness. I never knew who I'd come home to. The man who'd hold me close, or the man whose silence felt like a storm about to break. He started keeping score of everything. How often I texted first, how much I smiled at strangers, how long it took me to reply when he called. One night he asked, "Do you even love me anymore?" I blinked, stunned. "Of course I do. Then why do you act like I'm the only one trying?" I wanted to scream that I was trying so hard, every second, every breath, that I'd given him everything. But instead I just whispered, "I'm sorry. I was always sorry. Sorry for what I said. Sorry for what I didn't. Sorry for existing wrong." I stopped recognizing myself around that time. My laughter sounded fake. My reflection looked like a stranger. I used to be bright, full of ideas, plans, life. Now I was small, quiet, careful. One night, I was cooking dinner when he came home late. I smiled and said, "Hey, you're just in time." He looked at the table and frowned. "I told you I don't like spaghetti." I froze, spoon in hand. You said you did." He slammed the plate down. "You never listen." The sound made me jump. My throat burned. My eyes filled with tears. He sighed, suddenly softer. "God, Lena, why do you always make me the bad guy?" He reached out to touch my face. I flinched, he noticed, and for a split second his face twisted, hurt, disbelief, something dark. He pulled his hand back and walked away without another word. That night I cried quietly in the bathroom again, staring at the girl in the mirror. Her eyes were tired. Her shoulders were slumped. I whispered to her, "You're losing yourself." But I didn't know how to stop. The next morning, he acted like nothing had happened. He kissed me on the cheek and said, "You worry too much." He laughed when I asked if we were okay. "We're fine," he said. But his smile didn't reach his eyes. Weeks turned into months. We became ghosts haunting the same apartment. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night and watch him sleep. He looked peaceful then, like the man I first fell in love with. And I'd ache to touch him, to bring that version of him back. But love isn't magic. You can't resurrect someone who's already chosen to disappear. One evening, after another fight I couldn't even remember the reason for, I left the apartment and walked for hours. It was cold. My hands were shaking. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I needed to breathe air that didn't taste like him. When I finally came home, he was waiting. He didn't shout. He didn't even ask where I'd been. He just looked at me, eyes full of something sharp and unspoken, and said, "You're not the same girl I fell in love with." I wanted to say, "Of course I'm not. You took pieces of her and never gave them back." But all I said was, "I know." That night, when he turned away from me in bed, I stared at the ceiling and realized I wasn't in love anymore. I was in survival. A few weeks later, something inside me snapped, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly. He was yelling about something small. A bill. A call I didn't answer fast enough, I don't even remember. But as his voice rose, I suddenly stopped hearing him. I watched his lips move, watched his hands gesture, and all I felt was nothing. That nothing terrified me, because love wasn't supposed to feel like emptiness. That was the night I decided to leave. Not yet, not tomorrow, but someday soon. I didn't tell him. I didn't even admit it to myself fully. But a tiny spark of freedom had lit inside me. Faint, flickering, but real. And once you remember what freedom feels like, you can't unremember it. Leaving doesn't start the day you pack a bag. It starts the day you realize you deserve peace more than you fear loneliness. For me, that moment came quietly, on a Tuesday morning that looked like every other day. Evan was in the shower. I was standing by the kitchen counter, staring at the coffee machine, waiting for it to finish brewing. The sunlight hit the floor just right, and I suddenly thought, if I walked out that door right now, would he even notice? That thought scared me, not because of what it said about him, but because of what it said about me. For weeks after that, I lived two lives. The one he could see, cooking, smiling, pretending, saying, "I love you," when I didn't mean it. And the one I hid, quiet, careful, planning. I started saving money again. Little by little, I got a part-time job at a bookstore a few blocks away, telling him I was volunteering. It wasn't much, but it was mine. At night, when he slept, I'd open my laptop and search for apartments. I'd scroll through pictures of tiny places, chipped walls, cracked windows, and dream of what freedom might sound like. One night, Evan asked, "Do you still love me?" The question came out of nowhere. I froze. He was lying beside me, eyes dark in the dim light. "Of course," I said softly, but even I didn't believe my voice. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he smiled, that cold, unreadable smile that always made my stomach twist, and whispered, "Good, because no one else ever will." It should have broken me. Instead, it woke something inside me. The next morning, I called my mom. It was the first time in months, She sounded surprised and worried. "Sweetheart, is everything okay?" I wanted to lie, to tell her everything was fine, but the words got stuck. My throat tightened, my eyes filled, and before I could stop myself, I whispered, "Mom, I think I'm in trouble." There was silence. Then her voice, trembling but firm, "Come home, Lena." And that's when I knew I was leaving. I waited 3 more days. I don't know why. Maybe because I needed the courage to stop waiting for the perfect moment. Maybe because I was still trying to believe there was a version of him worth saving. But the truth was, I was the one who needed saving. The night before I left, it rained again. Heavy, endless rain that made the world outside blur. Evan came home late. He was drunk, angry about something. He dropped his jacket, shouted about dinner being cold. I stood there, numb, as he yelled. The words didn't hurt anymore. They just echoed off the walls. He stopped mid-sentence, maybe realizing I wasn't reacting. His face softened. He reached out and said, "Hey, don't look at me like that. I'm sorry, but it was too late." Something in me had shut off. The part that believed his sorry meant anything. That night, when he finally fell asleep, I sat at the edge of the bed and watched the rain slide down the window. Each drop looked like a tiny goodbye. I whispered, "I forgive you," even though I knew he'd never hear it. Then I whispered something I hadn't said in years. "I forgive me too." The next morning I left before sunrise. I packed 1 suitcase, clothes, some money, my old sketchbook, and the small silver pendant he'd given me the first year we met. I didn't keep it because I missed him. I kept it to remind myself that even the most beautiful things can turn into chains. I didn't leave a note. There was nothing left to say. As I closed the door behind me, I expected to feel fear. But what I felt was air, clean, cold, alive. I walked to the bus stop in the rain, suitcase rolling behind me. Every step felt heavy and light at the same time. I was shaking, but not from the cold, from the realization that I had finally done it. When the bus pulled up, I hesitated. Part of me still wanted to turn around, to see if he'd come running after me. He didn't. And in that silence, I found my freedom. The first few weeks after leaving were brutal. I cried until my body hurt. I woke up expecting his voice, his smell, his arms, only to find silence. But slowly, the silence started to change. It stopped feeling empty and started feeling like peace. I rented a small room above a bookstore. The walls were thin, the floor creaked, and the window looked out at the city skyline. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I got a job. I started painting again. I even smiled without forcing it. Healing wasn't pretty. It was messy. Some days I missed him. Some days I hated him. But most days I learned how to love myself again, the way I used to before I ever knew his name. One evening, months later, I passed by that same coffee shop where we first met. For a moment I froze in front of the window. The same table was there, the same smell of espresso and rain, and I realized something that made my chest ache. I didn't miss him. I missed her, the version of me that existed before him. So I walked inside, ordered a coffee, and sat at that same table. Only this time, I wasn't waiting for anyone. I was home. People think freedom feels like fireworks, loud, bright, powerful. But it doesn't. For me, freedom felt quiet. It sounded like nothing. Like silence so deep I didn't know whether to cry or fall asleep inside it. The first few weeks after I left Evan were the hardest days of my life. I had spent years revolving around someone else, his moods, his needs, his love. And suddenly, there was just me. At night, I'd lie awake, listening to the ticking of the clock and wondering if he missed me. During the day, I'd catch myself reaching for my phone, expecting his messages. There were moments when I almost turned back, when loneliness felt heavier than freedom. But every time that thought came, I'd remember the sound of his anger, the silence that followed it, the way I used to shrink when he entered the room, and I'd whisper to myself, "No, not again." My new apartment was tiny, barely big enough for a bed, a desk, and a few plants that kept dying no matter how much I tried. But it was mine, every inch of it. I could hang what I wanted on the walls. I could leave the lights on all night if I wanted to. No one told me what to wear, who to see, what to say. Freedom, I learned, wasn't loud. It was the right to be small again, and safe. The healing didn't come all at once. Some days I felt strong. I'd make coffee, read a book, take long walks and feel alive again. Other days I'd collapse on the floor and cry until my throat hurt. Healing, I realized, is like learning to walk again after forgetting how. There was a day I saw someone who looked like him at the grocery store. Same walk, same jacket, same careless smile. For a second my heart stopped. Then I realized it wasn't him. And I couldn't explain why, but that hurt too. Because it meant that even though he was gone, he still lived in the reflex of my heartbeat. I hated that. I hated that he still had power over my pulse. But slowly, that power began to fade. I started going to therapy. The first session I barely spoke. The second, I cried. By the third, I finally said it out loud. I loved someone who made me forget how to love myself. The therapist nodded and said softly, "And now you're learning again." That word, learning, stayed with me. Because healing isn't a miracle, it's a skill, and I was finally learning it. One morning, I woke up to sunlight flooding the room. The air smelled of rain from the night before. I stood by the window, breathing it in, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel afraid. I made coffee, my coffee, strong and bitter, and played music. Not our playlist, mine. I danced in the kitchen, clumsy and barefoot, laughing when I almost tripped over my own feet. I realized I wasn't dancing for him. I was dancing because I started writing again, painting again. Little by little, I rebuilt the pieces of me that had gone missing. One evening, I sat on the floor with my sketchbook and began drawing a woman standing in the rain, holding a burning letter. When I was done, I realized that woman was me. The girl who had once begged for love now burned her pain to light her own way. I smiled. For the first time, I liked the woman in my drawings. Months passed. Seasons changed. The city bloomed again. I started to see beauty in small things. A stranger's laugh, a cup of warm tea, the sound of wind against the window. The world was still imperfect, but it no longer scared me. Sometimes I still thought about Evan, not with hate, not with love, just with understanding. He was a storm that taught me how to build shelter, a fire that showed me I could survive the burn. I didn't need revenge or closure. I just needed peace, and I finally had it. One night, I was sitting on my balcony, wrapped in a blanket, when it began to rain. The city lights shimmered across the wet pavement, the same way they had the night I first met him. But this time I didn't feel the ache. I felt gratitude, because if I hadn't met him, I might never have met myself. I whispered into the rain, "Thank you for the lesson." And for the first time I meant it. The next day, I walked into that same cafe, the one where our story began. The smell of coffee, the hum of voices, the quiet rhythm of cups. It all felt familiar but new. I ordered my drink and sat at a window seat, the rain still dripping outside. There was a couple sitting across the room, laughing, holding hands, falling in love. For a moment, I watched them, remembering what it felt like to believe that love was magic. And then I smiled. Not because I missed it, but because I knew I'd find it again someday. This time, in a way that wouldn't require me to lose myself. Before I left, I wrote something on a napkin and tucked it under my cup. It said, "If love costs you yourself, it's too expensive." I didn't look back. As I stepped into the rain, I realized that my story, our story, wasn't one of heartbreak anymore. It was one of rebirth.